Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a question that sounds like it belongs in an action movie, but actually makes for a strangely calm bedtime story. Did ancient gladiators really fight to the death? You've seen the Hollywood version. Sand flying, swords clashing, and some guy in shiny armor dramatically shouting before stabbing another guy in slow motion. But reality, as usual, was messier, less cinematic, and honestly more boring, which makes it perfect for a sleepy history ramble. So, go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe sip something warm, and let's drift back to Rome, where blood, sweat, and questionable decision-making were all part of the evening entertainment. Now, before we dive into the gore, or in many cases the lack thereof, it's important to set the scene. The Colosseum wasn't just a place where people fought. It was a full-blown entertainment complex, a cultural stage, and also a massive tool of political propaganda. Imagine the world's largest movie theater, but instead of popcorn and reclining chairs, you had emperors showing off their generosity by hosting games. And instead of watching an action flick, you got actual human beings smacking each other with sharp metal things. A little different vibe. The first thing to understand is that gladiators were not disposable action figures. They were more like highly trained, expensive athletes. A wealthy sponsor could spend the equivalent of a fortune buying, training, and maintaining these men. And once you've invested in a living weapon who can fill your arena with cheering fans, you don't want him dead after his first show. It's like buying a very expensive racehorse and then letting it run straight into a brick wall. Not great for business. That's not to say no one ever died in the arena. People did. Swords are sharp, accidents happen, and sometimes the fight was deliberately lethal. But the idea that every match ended in one guy dramatically bleeding out while the crowd screamed, "Finish him!" Well, that's more video game than history. Most bouts ended with one fighter conceding, the crowd booing or cheering, and the loser slinking back to the gladiator barracks to train for another day. Let's also clear up the whole thumbs up, thumbs down thing while we're here, because Hollywood has made that one of its favorite cliches. The truth is, we don't actually know which thumb gesture meant what. Ancient sources just say things like, pollice verso, literally, with turned thumb. But turned how? Up? Down? Sideways? Scholars have argued about this for centuries, and no one has a definitive answer. It's possible that thumbs up meant, kill him, thumbs down meant spare him, or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe it was sideways. Maybe it depended on who was asking, which is a very long-winded way of saying. The emperor's decision mattered more than the crowd's hand signals, and the hand signals were not standardized like traffic lights. Speaking of emperors, they were a huge part of the gladiator drama. Hosting games was one of the best ways to show off your wealth and win popularity. Julius Caesar once put on a show with hundreds of gladiators just to prove how generous and terrifying he was. Later emperors like Titus and Domitian used the Colosseum as their personal stage. And then, of course, there was Commodus, who decided he didn't just want to watch the games. He wanted to star in them. Because why not double down on your bad decisions? Commodus liked to fight as a gladiator himself. Except, of course, the matches were rigged, and he always won. Imagine the awkwardness of being the poor guy told to lose gracefully to your emperor while pretending he's actually a skilled warrior. That's less glorious duel, and more extremely tense workplace performance review. Now, here's a fun detail. Gladiators weren't all slaves. Many were, of course, captured prisoners of war, criminals, or people sold into the trade. But some men actually volunteered. Yes, volunteered. They signed up to live in the gladiator barracks, train, and risk their necks in the arena. Why? Well, for the same reason people today go on reality TV shows. Fame, money, the chance to break out of obscurity. Being a gladiator gave you an audience, and if you were good enough, you could become a celebrity. There were even groupies. Ancient graffiti survives with people writing things like, Crescens, the gladiator, makes all the girls sigh. Basically, the first sports fan posters. But fame had its price. Gladiators lived under strict rules. Their diet, surprisingly, was heavy on beans and grains, not steak. They were nicknamed barley men, which is less intimidating than warrior of the arena. Their bodies were trained for endurance more than raw speed. Their weapons and armor were carefully chosen to match their class of fighter, Netman with trident versus heavily armored sword guy, for example. The fights were staged in such a way as to maximize drama, variety, and crowd entertainment. It was less about fair play and more about spectacle. And through all of this, the risk of death hovered, but it wasn't the default. Sponsors wanted return on investment. Crowds wanted drama, not necessarily corpses. Gladiators themselves wanted to survive to fight another day. So yes, people died, but no, not in every match. In fact, historians estimate that the average gladiator could survive for years, fighting many bouts. Mortality rates may have been around 10 to 15% in the arena, which is still terrifyingly high compared to, say, modern boxing, but much lower than the Hollywood myth of 100%. So, we've established that gladiators weren't just disposable meat for the Colosseum grinder. They were investments, celebrities, and, in their own strange way, cultural icons. But what was life actually like for these men, or, in some rare cases, women, when they weren't swinging weapons around under the Roman sun? Let's start with the barracks, or ludi. These were the gladiator training schools, and they were basically part military camp, part gym, and part prison. Imagine a strict boarding school where instead of math homework, your assignment is, don't die in tomorrow's match. Gladiators slept in small, cramped cells, usually 2 or 3 to a room. Their days were filled with drills, weapons training, physical exercise, and strict dietary routines. It wasn't a cushy life, but it also wasn't total deprivation. After all, a half-starved gladiator isn't much use in the arena. And yes, let's talk about the food again, because people always picture these guys as steak-eating, meat-devouring machines. In reality, their diet was mostly vegetarian. Grains, beans, and barley formed the bulk of their meals. Meat was occasional, not the norm. Archaeological studies of gladiator bones have actually confirmed this. They had high levels of strontium, which comes from eating a lot of plants. They even made a special drink of vinegar and ash, sort of an early sports recovery beverage. Supposedly, it helped strengthen their bones. So, picture less protein-packed carnivore, and more Roman vegan with a weird Gatorade recipe. Now, about training. Gladiators were sorted into different classes, depending on their style, weapons, and armor. The retiarius fought with a net and a trident, designed to look lightly armored but quick. The secutor was his counterpart, heavily armored, with a short sword and a smooth helmet that conveniently made it very hard for the net to catch. You had Myrmillos with their big fish-crested helmets, Thracians with curved swords, and Hoplomachus who basically mimicked Greek warriors. Each class was carefully matched to create a dramatic show. The idea wasn't who's strongest, but what combination will entertain the crowd. Think of it like wrestling today, different characters, different fighting styles, each with their own fan base. And yes, people really did have favorites. Some gladiators had massive followings, with their names scrawled on walls as ancient graffiti. We have records of women swooning over particularly good-looking fighters, leaving behind notes like, Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh, which sounds like the Roman equivalent of boy band fan mail. Of course, there was also the dark side. Gladiators could be seen as dangerous and corrupting influences, too alluring for proper Roman women to admire. So, their fame was always a double-edged sword. Let's also clear up a myth. Gladiators weren't always treated as total outcasts. Sure, many were slaves, but skilled fighters could earn respect, admiration, and even freedom. A successful gladiator might be awarded a rudis, a symbolic wooden sword that meant retirement and freedom. Some chose to leave the arena. Others, bizarrely, kept fighting even after being freed. Maybe they loved the thrill, maybe they couldn't imagine another life, or maybe the paycheck was just too good. Remember, gladiators could earn serious money if they were popular enough. A handful managed to get rich, at least by Roman standards. But here's the irony. While gladiators could be admired, they were also seen as socially shameful. Roman elites loved to watch them, cheer for them, and bet on their fights, but they also considered gladiators dishonorable. They were lumped in with actors and prostitutes as people who sold their bodies for entertainment, which is very Roman, enjoying something intensely while also sneering at the people who provide it. Now, not every fight in the arena was between gladiators. Sometimes criminals were thrown in for execution, often in extremely theatrical ways. Condemned men might be forced to reenact a myth, say, pretending to be Orpheus while being mauled by wild animals. Or they might be burned, crucified, or fed to lions as halftime entertainment between gladiator bouts. For the crowd, this was just part of the show, a kind of gruesome bonus feature. But it also explains why people think gladiators always fought to the death. The lines between execution, staged spectacle, and actual gladiatorial combat were often blurred. Speaking of blurred lines, let's drift over to female gladiators because yes, they existed. The Romans called them gladiatrices. They weren't common, but they were very real. Ancient writers loved to mock them, often with that mix of fascination and disdain people still use when talking about women doing unfeminine things. These women fought with similar weapons to men, and audiences found the novelty exciting. Emperor Domitian, in particular, was fond of putting women and even dwarfs in the arena for spectacle, which tells you a lot about Domitian's idea of good entertainment. Basically, let's make it weird. Female gladiators weren't celebrated like their male counterparts. Instead, they were treated as exotic, shocking curiosities. But they remind us that the Roman arena was a flexible space, constantly experimenting with new ways to keep the crowd interested. And then there were animal hunts or venations. Trained hunters called bestiarii faced exotic animals shipped in from across the empire. Lions, leopards, elephants, even crocodiles. The sheer scale of animal slaughter in Rome was staggering. Entire species were nearly wiped out just to feed the appetite for spectacle. The Colosseum floor could be transformed into forests, lakes, or mountains to stage these hunts. For the audience, it was thrilling. For the animals, obviously less so. And for the gladiators? Well, at least they could say, hey, I only have to fight other humans. That guy's wrestling a bear. Let's float back now to the actual question we started with. Did gladiators fight to the death? By this point, you can probably guess the answer. Sometimes yes, but usually no. And when someone did die, it was often because the sponsor wanted blood, or because the crowd was unusually bloodthirsty, or simply because accidents happened. The average fight ended with one man wounded, disarmed, or just too exhausted to keep going. The loser might kneel, raise a finger, and appeal for mercy. The sponsor or emperor would then decide whether he lived or died. Of course, emperors didn't always make rational choices. Commodus, as mentioned earlier, loved to stage himself as a gladiator, and he wasn't shy about killing real opponents. Caligula once executed people in the arena simply because he was bored, and later emperors sometimes treated the games more like personal playgrounds than public entertainment. So while the fight to the death wasn't the standard, it wasn't unheard of either, especially under rulers who thought subtlety was overrated. Still, the overall picture is one of survival. Gladiators were valuable, crowds were entertained by skill just as much as by blood, and the games were structured to maximize drama while minimizing waste, which is why so many gladiators had careers spanning years, building reputations, rivalries, and fan followings. They weren't anonymous, one-time victims. They were recurring characters in Rome's greatest live-action series.